Isabelle.
And I'm Ben.
Welcome to Conversations in Company, a podcast from the charity Suicide&Co, here to make the suicide loss a little less lonely.
We've both been on this journey for a few years.
I lost my cousin to suicide in 2017.
And I lost my brother to suicide in 2018.
We really hope that we and our guests can offer you some companionship wherever you are on this journey. Hello.
Hello.
Hi.
We've got our first guest in this episode, the Reverend Kate. Thank you so much for joining us, Kate. Really been looking forward to our chat, actually, because me and Isabelle have spoken about this sort of from a surface level point of view before, but I think we both realise actually it's quite important to get someone that's more involved in sort of religious communities than we are to sort of to chat about this in some more depth. Because I think religion and spirituality plays an enormous part in the grieving process generally for a lot of people. But actually, when we talk about suicide, there is a potentially difficult conversation to be had around it. And there's clearly things that are affected amongst certain religions around the world. And I just think it's really important for a lot of people that we chat about that and have open conversations. So we both really appreciate you coming on and talking about that.
Oh, thank you. No, it is a really important conversation, and I think a lot of communities, regardless of religion or cultural background, have difficulty having collective conversations about suicide. Grief is already stigmatized enough, and then bereavement from suicide is sort of additionally stigmatized. And obviously, the more people talk, the more people share information and share their stories and their feelings, the easier it becomes for everybody to understand what one another is going through.
Well, that's why we're here.
Exactly. And that's exactly why we came up with the podcast and started doing the podcast, and why we both feel so passionate about this, because when you go through any sort of grief, there is that stigma that exists, not just in religion, but throughout society. And I think it's just important that we have this platform, or I hope it's important for people that we have this platform where we can just have a sort of friendly chat about some difficult aspects of it. And I know for a lot of people, this can be difficult. I know from my experience, I've got a few members of my family that are religious Christianity, and they sort of, I assume, and through conversation with them, I know they found that quite confusing and quite difficult to come to terms with. Sam, we ended up, Sam got buried in the church near us, and I remember actually at the time when that was all happening, someone said, "Oh, isn't it great that we're allowed to have Sam buried?" And I remember thinking, I was quite taken aback, by the fact that someone had gone, "Oh, isn't that great that he's been allowed?" It's like, oh, it's amazing in this modern day that this reverend of our local church, who is absolutely lovely man, allowed us to bury him. And obviously, from me, and we've spoken about this before, Isabelle, like churches, although I wouldn't consider myself religious, have always been somewhere that I've found a little bit of like peace, and they're very peaceful places to just go. And I know from, with the Reverend in Frittenden where I live, he was just so amazing in the early moments of coming around to our house and sort of counselling the family, as it felt at the time when we were sort of planning the funeral. It was an amazing thing. And I'm sure you in your work come across grief and people that are going through grief all the time.
Yeah, Kate, maybe give us a bit of a background about what you do and your job, also your relationship with faith.
Yeah, so like a lot of religious folk, I sort of find myself in two roles. I work in a university as a lead chaplain, and that means that I'm in an interfaith role that involves a lot of pastoral care, some of which is with religious people and some of which isn't. And an awful lot of it is around loss, which can be everything from sort of loss of sense of self that comes from having the kinds of difficult mental health experiences, or just what it means to be late adolescent, which obviously a lot of our students are, loss of relationships, but also bereavements, both present and historic, resurfacing. I think it's Carrie Lloyd I've heard say, but a lot of people have said this very succinctly, that when you experience a positive change in your life, historic bereavements will often resurface, because nothing is universally positive when there's somebody missing who should have been there to share it with you. So I'll often find myself talking to people around graduation, for example, remembering friends who've died, or family members who won't be there to see them cross the stage. And posthumous degrees and awarding posthumous degrees is a big part of my work with bereavement. So I can be working with families for quite a long time, depending on when they want a ceremony to be. And I've noticed a lot of different attitudes, as you would expect, to cause of death, particularly when suicide is involved or suspected to be involved, that some families want to name it and want to be part of, I suppose, destigmatizing their own grief, but also making a positive change in the lives of the other people who are grieving, particularly a student or staff member's peers, to say to them, you know, don't let our bereavement lead to another family's bereavement. We know that people bereaved by suicide often feel suicidal, and they want to be really positive and proactive. A lot of mental health charities have come about, as you know, from bereavement by suicide, and some want to be a lot more closed about it. And interestingly, at one memorial, we do more ceremonies than services. It's the nature of the work. We're not really sort of out there doing church services. But I was working with a member of the Hindu community to commemorate somebody who died with a tree planting, and he said, "Oh, I have to say different Vedas because this person died by suicide, and to honor the manner of their death, we use different Vedas for this type of death," which surprised me, because usually we're very closed off about cause of death and consider it to be something quite private.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's my place to share it unless the family do. But I'm now beginning to realize that when I'm working with people particularly people of other faiths and traditions, and people coming in to do ceremonies, I actually do need to tell them, because it may influence what they need to know and what they need to share.
Interesting. And so you're a Christian minister.
Yes, my ministry is in the Metropolitan Community Churches. We were founded in 1968 by a man called the Reverend Troy Perry, who left his Pentecostal background to start a church that I think started as being described as a safe place for, probably they said homosexuals, actually. And I know Time magazine published an article called "A Church for Homosexuals" in the 1970s. There was a Wicca's World as well, where everybody's got big moustaches and is talking very earnestly about homosexual rights. I now prefer the term queer-centric, because a lot of churches are welcoming to some degree or other of the LGBTQ plus community and our allies. But we have in MCC a safe place to center our experiences, and to be in a majority and not to have to apologize for anything that we are. And because of the LGBTQ plus community's overrepresentation in all forms of mental distress, whether we're labeling them illness or not, we do experience higher levels both of suicidality and of death by suicide in our congregations, I think, than I would necessarily expect in other churches of a similar size.
From your point of view, then, obviously from your experience in your particular church, what I find really interesting about religion in all its forms is actually it's a lot to do with interpretation, and clearly, you know, your church has found an interpretation of, you know, historic religious views that is very different to sort of orthodox views, which is amazing and so useful, because I've done a lot of work in the past with sort of religious groups, and I guess that's the difficulty for some people, is that the box that it is sometimes is different to where they fit in, and it's amazing that you can sort of create that different interpretation and be that beacon of hope and give that platform to people that need it. I guess from my point of view, the same can be said around suicide. When we look at how suicide is viewed around the world by different religions, Buddhism, Judaism, Christianity, all of these, generally speaking, the texts are negative towards suicide. But interestingly, with Christianity in particular, it's actually quite, from what I've read at least, it's quite inexplicit in terms of whether it's bad or not, and actually a huge amount of it comes down to interpretation of situations or of stories. There's no real explicit this is wrong. And what's interesting for me is then it becomes this sort of affirming cycle of stigma exists around suicide, so we interpret this to mean a certain thing, which creates stigma around suicide, which creates interpretation of this thing. And I find it really interesting. Where do you think, particularly from a sort of multi-faith point of view, where do you think the view of suicide is now in the modern day compared to how it might have been historically?
Yeah, I mean, I can only speak for Christianity, and even then, really, I can only speak for my own Christianity. And I will say that I don't see very much interfaith work going on around even mental health, let alone going as far as to talk about suicide. And as you know, there are layers of destigmatization happening with mental health, and we're at a point now where I think, and I'm very grateful for open conversations about anxiety and depression. But although I've been open in some contexts about my own experience of suicidality and the associated risks and things I've survived to get to this point, there are people who still think that in a position of authority in a religious organization, I shouldn't name that, and I shouldn't sort of encourage people to think that it's all right to be suicidal, which is absolutely bizarre to me, because the relationship, I think, with sexuality is actually quite an important one. I found that churches that stigmatize aspects of human being will stigmatize multiple aspects of human being. So when I was a very young adult, when I was a teenager and still living at home and attending a church with some of my friends, that was not open to the idea of people being in what they would call same-sex relationships or acting on their same-sex attraction. It's another fun phrase that I used to hear. Would connect it very closely with the experiences I was having of poor mental health, and I don't know that I really named suicidal feelings to them. I think I instinctively would have known that was unsafe. And this kind of sense that all of this stuff is wrapped up in, well, if you are less at odds with God in terms of your sexuality, and you pray better and you do better and you put your identity in Christ, which is something I'll come back to in a minute, then all of this will be lifted off you and everything will be fine. And it's just not realistic. That's a version of an evangelical Christian view that I was exposed to at quite a young age that was extremely harmful. And the same texts are often interpreted to benefit people putting out those attitudes in both ways. I was thinking about this earlier. Sorry, I'm looking down because I've got a Bible open in front of me because I was skimming something earlier. It's in 1 Corinthians. If anyone wants to look it up, it's oh goodness me, I need better glasses. 6:19 says, "Do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit, which you have from God? You are not your own, for you were bought with a price," which is a reference to a particular theology of the cross. You were bought with a price, therefore glorify God in your body. And that I have seen used against both any form of self-harm, suicidal and non-suicidal, but also against so-called sexual immorality. So there is a strong connection there. And texts, to quote the brilliant Dan McClellan from I think Birmingham University, who does the Data Over Dogma podcast, text doesn't speak. And the texts that we have in Christianity have gone through multiple iterations we don't have what could be called an original of any book of the Bible, either the First Testament or the Second Testament. So we can't say this is the original. We can't be certain about authorship of most of these texts. The Gospels are not the first books to be written of the Second Testament. The letters of Paul are. They predate some of the Gospels by up to about 50 years. So we've got this really complicated relationship with text where oral history becomes textual. So even if we had the first written version of a text, we don't have the first oral version. And in order to make sense of what's quite a complicated set, in the Protestant Christian versions of the Bible, it's 66 books. The Apocrypha is a bit longer, and obviously the Torah, the writings, and so on that form the First Testament, and Jewish scripture is about 2/3 of that, I think. So we have this really complicated text that arose over up to a millennium, depending on which textual critics and archaeologists one pays attention to, and that was written in languages that some of which we understand very well on a linguistic level. But I mean, Isabelle, I know you did a languages degree as well, so you know that translation is not just a matter of reading the words off the page. I will never be a first century Judean who understands Koine Greek. I can only ever be a 21st century Christian who's been taught Koine Greek, probably by other 21st century Christians. I don't have access to what St. Paul means by words, particularly words that are unique to him. And one of the ways we detect stigma in text is what is missing. So as you've said, Ben, there's a lot of reading between the lines. In order to justify, my interpretation is that we're justifying a cultural discomfort with suicide. And I suspect with other traditions that are text-based, where there isn't much in the text, and yet a tradition has grown up that suicide is somehow sinful or harms the soul, that there's a lot of reading between. A lot of, I am innately uncomfortable with this. I'm choosing to believe that my innate discomfort relates to my relationship to God, the Creator, which most theistic religions have a relationship with God, where God is creator of humanity, and where humanity in some sense exists in the image of God. So I'm going to assume that my discomfort belongs to God, whether that's that I'm squeamish about certain forms of sex, or whether that's because I'm terrified of death, and I'm terrified of the idea that I or others around me might be tempted to take control of my death. And even the fact I use the word tempted there says something, because that in itself actually is language around sin, which just slips out. It's just there in everything we say.
There's a lot to think about there. No, it's fine. It's interesting because it's like, you know, lots of layers to think about where all of stigma comes from, and where like the stigma around suicide, and how like around suicidality, and how that must then impact people who have suicidal ideation. And also I wonder, just innately, as a country that has had like Christian values for, you know, obviously we're significantly more multicultural now, but you know, for a long time this country has been predominantly Christian, and I wonder how that has informed both like governmental policy, but also just like our society.
I think enormously. I mean, although we are a multicultural society on the ground, with all faiths and worldviews represented, I'd be surprised if there's very much you can find that's got you know, significant religious following or secular worldview following around the world that isn't represented somewhere in the UK. And yet we have religious people appointed to the House of Lords who have to be not just Christian but Church of England. So, you know, Christians beyond the Church of England are not represented, and the King is the head of the church. I think, and somebody I'm sure will tell you if I'm wrong, that we're only the UK and Iran are remaining constitutional theocracies, meaning that the head of the church is the head of the state. And that's the position in the UK. We have an enfranchised church, the Church of England, an established church, of which the head is the monarch. And whilst neither of the monarchs who have reigned in my lifetime have ever sort of acted on that, some of the surprise and even shock, I think, around the number of faiths represented and Christian traditions represented at the coronation of the king came from the fact that the king is not obliged to do that. He can and did to some extent. It was a very Anglican ceremony in a Church of England church presided over by the primate of the Anglican Communion, by the head of the Anglican Communion, who is the Archbishop of Canterbury. And that is our state religion. So I understand people saying, and to some extent rightly, we're not a Christian country. Culturally, no, in many ways we're not. Constitutionally, we are, and we can't escape from it. So where Christianity takes hold of an idea, whether that's a scriptural idea or a traditional one, it holds fast. So things around who can be buried in Church of England consecrated ground, for example, I don't know whether that was ever made into law, but canon law, which is how we describe the church laws, in this case of the Church of England, has often been considered to have quite similar status. And people will assume that things are illegal if they believe them to be immoral. And, I don't think there was ever legislation against same-sex sexual activity between women, for example. There's the old apocryphal story that no one wanted to explain it to Queen Victoria, but I don't really believe that. But I think that's also to do with power. Men are very concerned about preserving their power. They're concerned about, other men's survival in a number of different ways, and that includes their social survival. So legislations around social norms are always going to be about preserving the people in power to remain in power. Denying people with mental illnesses the vote has also probably contributed, and disenfranchising prisoners, a large number of whom are going to have experienced either bereavement by suicide or have had suicidal episodes themselves. All of these things actually disenfranchise people that come from a perspective of understanding suicide. And I don't know that they're intentional, but it's because we're talking about a really complex social issue where privilege and power are always going to be at play. And it goes all the way across to how seriously you're taken in hospitals. Writing up a paper as part of my MA, I've started writing about related issues as part of my dissertation. One of the things I noticed is that I was drawing parallels all the way across about how hospital staff treated me after instances of self-harm and how the church treated me, and finding that actually the same kind of language, the same kind of dismissiveness, the same kind of idea that surely you can just take control and stop wasting our time actually persisted across both, which also suggests to me that this is about culture as much as it is about religion.
Yeah. And I wonder how that informs the, how a Britishness is informed by Christianity informs people of all religions. While like certain other religions may have like specific practices or views or traditional views about suicide or the way to deal with bereavement of any kind. And I wonder what the intersection between those two is. I'm quite fascinated with how different religions deal with grief anyway, like and I just remember reading about sitting Shiva in Judaism, and like people actively taking a time to grieve communally with a family, and I wonder how British Jews how that is informed, and whether there's a difference textually, probably not with Judaism or with monotheistic religions, but like how British Hindus have been affected by like the stiff upper lipness of Britishness compared with a very different religious and cultural background. I don't have the answer. It's interesting.
No, and I think it's always going to be really hard to say, because we're in a bit of a cycle where British Hindus from the Indian subcontinent are still living with the generational culture created by British colonialism, which in itself may have influenced their cultural interpretations of Hinduism. And because most religions have some sense of stigma around suicide, I think most compassionate people still respond with compassion when around people who have been bereaved by suicide. But there are going to be long histories of stigmatizing beliefs in all religions, and of course we're mutually influenced as well. So people talk a lot about karma from a very cultural and sort of non-Buddhist informed way, but actually
Guilty.
ideas of well, we all do it.
Yeah.
It's in the same way that we have Hindi language influence words like shampoo. We're constantly passing this sort of cultural baton back and forth, and I think what we look for in cultures, a bit in the same way that we look for them in religion, naturally humans look for moments of connection. And so I think where it's easier to make connections is often, it's not always going to be negative, it's not always going to be about things that are prohibited, but if there's a shared stigma, often those things do then sort of slide into a mutuality of culture. It's, oh well, we understand this because we also have this idea. But it's also, what do we term suicide? And one of the things that fascinates me about Christianity is how we consider agency in relation to the Trinity and the cross. So at the heart of the Christian story is this idea that somehow this a death at the heart of the Gospels and Jesus's resurrection after death is interpreted as the thing that makes the difference with how God and humanity relate to one another. The most common interpretation of that certainly that I hear espoused the most, something called penal substitution, which is kind of God's pound of flesh, to use a Shakespearean analogy, or I suppose people will call back to the sacrifice or almost sacrifice of Isaac back in Genesis in the First Testament. But and that's sort of the idea that somebody had to atone for everybody's sins, so God sent Jesus to do it. I'm more of the thought that we should be looking at the ways in which humanity harms one another and how the resurrection presents a model of recovery. Not obviously that everybody who dies at the hands of the state will immediately be resurrected, but that there are ways of understanding human behavior and providing hope for a future without those sort of imperializing, stigmatizing, anti-poverty, and so on. And I suppose racist. I mean, this is a Roman punishment, so it's Roman imperial powers acting against an occupied Palestine and fearing uprising. Jesus starts his life as a refugee, fleeing into Egypt. There's all of this stuff, and I don't think you can just sort of take the cross out of that context. And at the same time, how much agency Jesus appears to have in his death means that there are ways of interpreting, and this is theologically tricky, and I don't think I'm going to articulate it well at all, but there is a way of saying that going willingly to death gives Christ at the very least, a solidarity with people who could foresee and felt a part in their own death and the people who grieve them. I am not saying that the crucifixion of Christ is a suicidal act, but that I think as Christians we should have a much stronger sense of solidarity with people who have watched somebody predict their own death, fear their own death, feel unable to avoid their own death, and then have to sit with those people and grieve. Because particularly the Gospel of Mark is often referred to as sort of a passion narrative with an introduction. All the way through Mark, Jesus is saying, this is who I'm going to become and this is how I'm going to die. And not every person who is suicidal has years of experiencing feelings and seeking help and wondering what's going to become of them behind them. But it is common for people to have a long history or a short history of disclosing to people around them that that's how they feel and that's how they fear their life will end. And I do see a parallel there. Yeah. Again, so that you don't get letters without claiming that the crucifixion is itself an act of suicide.
That's really so. My cousin had multiple suicide attempts before she died, and and disclosed. So as you say that, it sort of, I can see the parallel with her. I also, it sort of brought up a little bit for me about thinking about, because this has been in the news in the past couple of months, but about euthanasia. What's the word? What's the
Assisted
phrase?
dying.
Assisted dying.
Yeah. And so, you know, there was someone in Holland who was saying she's, I think, in her 20s, and she's got quite severe mental health issues, and she was saying, I've decided that this is my time, and how I feel about that, and how I feel about it in comparison to my cousin's death, and how I feel about that agency. And it's funny almost seeing what your, the interpretation that you've given is that, like, there is a path, and there is a notification to other people in that path, and it's just making this, it's just giving me quite a lot to think about.
I think it's really interesting. It's really interesting, Kate, hearing you talk, because I think people that I come across are religious, and people in my family and people that have lost someone to suicide, that are dealing with real conflicts within the family because of religious views. There's this sort of general view that you can't criticize your religion or your faith, and if that's the way they interpret it, and that's the way I've been told to interpret it, then that's sort of the way I should interpret it. But everything you're saying is really interesting, because you've said a few things there that sort of go against the grain, but I wouldn't sit here and question your faith at all.
No.
Like, absolutely not. So I find that really interesting, that, and again, moving it back to sort of supporting people and that are going through suicide loss, like, questioning your religion and questioning your faith and questioning your interpretation of your faith doesn't make you less religious or worse at your religion or somehow not very good at it. Actually, I think from listening to you, it just makes you have a deeper understanding of your own religion and your own beliefs. So I think it's actually, from my point of view, as someone that's not religious, I look in that and actually look at that as a person that can do that as actually being quite in touch with their faith. I found that really interesting from hearing from you, and I'm sure that people will find that useful in those situations, that you don't have to worry about feeling, not capable or like you're doing it the wrong. If you don't mind, I have a slightly personal question, and if you don't want to answer it, then please don't. But I'm interested in your experience with faith. How has your faith helped you, and having faith helped you?
Yeah. I mean, in some ways, I always find this a really complicated question, because I can't say for sure what I would be experiencing if I believed something different. And I'm always very conscious that, as a Caucasian person born in West London, the chances were pretty high that if I was going to find a way to express a belief in God in life, it would be through Christianity. I mean, I suppose if I'd been born half a mile down the road, might have gone through a rebellious cultural appropriation streak and adopted Hinduism. But the reality is, I'm from a sort of church family. My parents aren't Christian and haven't been church attenders since I was quite little, but my mum's parents were church wardens, and the Church of England was really important to them. I'm really conscious that the religion we find is likely to have a cultural role in it, and I know that's not going to be everybody's view, but I find it difficult to believe in God who is going to take an actively punishing role in people who name them differently to the way that I name them. So I suppose that's the first thing, which means that sometimes I get a bit nervous about saying, oh, well, this is what Christianity gives me, because I don't want to come across as saying, you can have this, or this will be your experience, because it is just mine. And I don't think it's a coincidence that I was dealing with a lot of mental health challenges at the time that I wanted to have that encounter with God, and that I sought out church when I was about 15 or 16. But there's also there's a sort of comfort that goes above and beyond what I think I can do to self-soothe, that seems to come from prayer. That's, I guess, what I call God, or what I would call the Holy Spirit. but equally, I know I was talking to a Zen meditation practitioner, a Buddhist, who said that, you know, the way that energy moves around your body, which is part of his experience of being an embodied spirit, and I don't mean that literally, I just think that's often how we think of ourselves as humans, is that whether you lay your hand left over right or right over left in meditation can change your experience of meditation. So I find in the way that those neurons fire in my brain, in the way that my kind of neural pathways work and create a particular sort of experience, that for me parallels what other people say they experience of God. And I don't think God and spirit are separate from those biological functions. So it doesn't diminish it for me to say that there's a kind of neurotransmitter response that I feel when I'm praying and when I'm in churches, but also when I go to Juma on a Friday, when I sort of stand behind the brothers and watch them pray. The sisters section in our space is very small. I'm not intentionally avoiding them, but
So I'm just
outside the door happens to be the brothers area.
clarify that Juma is Friday prayers for Muslims. Just
Sorry.
clarify. No, it's fine. I just wanted to make sure that if it wasn't clear.
So yeah, so we have weekly Juma at work, weekly Friday prayer led by our Muslim chaplain. And when I stand there and listen to the sermon and watch people pray, that doesn't feel particularly different to me to standing in a church service. I'm probably less critical of the sermon, if anything. And I call that particular form of comfort spirituality. That's how it manifests for me. And it can come across as discomfort, that sort of, how do we even explain what goes on in our brains? But the same kind of embodied vibe can sometimes come up as a bit of, actually, this is wrong. In things like sitting comfortably or saying nothing when somebody is making statements that are contrary to what you know to be right. So I'll give an example from when I worked in retail because it really stuck out to me. I used to sell history and politics books, and I was in an academic bookshop, and a priest came in. I assume he was a priest and not just cosplaying, bought a book on the Crusades and sort of made like knowing eye contact with me and gave me a bit of a wink and was like, well, you know, history repeats itself, what? And maybe he knew, maybe he didn't, that there were two hijabi women standing behind him. And it's just this idea that we were in consort because we sort of look alike, if nothing else, ethnicity. And I suppose we probably had the same accent, that I was going to completely agree with him. And that little nudge that tells me that I should have said something in that moment. I mean, in my defense of 19-year-old Kate, being 19 is not easy best of times. So I just sort of gave apologetic shrugs to the women afterwards and carried on with my day. But it stuck with me because I had this kind of nudge of like, this was a moment you could have done something positive. And I see both of those things as being positive influences of how I understand God acting in the world, which is not necessarily the sort of Susie Eddie Izzard idea, which I have a great deal of sympathy for, that atheism is rational because God didn't prevent the Holocaust. I think, you know, you can argue that through the book of Job, and Carl Jung's response to Job is a really fascinating way of looking at text around mental distress, which largely Job is. Job is one of the writings of the First Testament. It's an analogous, not an analogous story. It's I suppose a fairy tale actually in some ways. Starts once upon a time in a land far, far away. You know, effectively about God and Satan. Satan in Hebrew means the tempter, so not sort of the Christian devil, which is a much later idea. Placing a bet. And Job's faith, as it's understood through this text, is that he stands by God even when God takes everything from him, and the tempter can't tempt him away. So I think, you know, for me, a lot of the positives about faith are about how you respond. A lot of my friends who have a more secular or atheist worldview, I think, imagine a kind of divine weighted blanket that, you know, can, or, you know, divine antidepressant or something that kind of takes the pain away. I don't think it's that. I think if you're in relationship with people, ideas, and communities that are meaningful to you, they can share the burden. But faith may not be uniquely placed for that. Being in a supportive family, and finding your own grieving rituals. And I do agree that things like sitting Shiva, which was sort of manifest in some ways in grieving rituals in English or British Christianity, until really fairly recently, that people would be expected to be in mourning and to show that they were in mourning. And there is something quite destructive about taking community away from people grieving. And that may be where religious people have a slight sort of ritual advantage, that we will ritualize our grief, where society doesn't encourage that anymore.
My aunt, so my cousin who died, Jen, her mum is still, and my mum's one of 5 siblings, and they were brought up very strict Catholic, and she is the only one who is still religious, and I think she goes to mass. Maybe not every day, but I think she might pop into the church every day, and she finds a huge amount of solace in that. And I think we had a bit of my cousin's funeral service was, I think, in a crematorium. And it was, I just remember her finding a little bit of a, like, I think there was a vicar doing the service, and it
would be a priest if they were Catholic. Vicar's a Church of England role.
Yeah, okay, but a priest doing the service, even though it was at a crematorium, but maybe that doesn't make sense. I'm not sure. But
no, anyone can take a crematorium service. It wouldn't have been a mass. He wouldn't say have the sacraments there without the altar and the divine presence in the reserved sacrament and so on. That was very clumsy. Apologies to Catholics.
But I think my aunt had a little bit of a moment where she was thinking, I've got a priest taking this service, and I don't want to. Jen I think the exact words were, having any kind of religious songs would have been an anathema for Jen, because she was just not religious at all. And it was just the kind of, for my aunt, the intersection of trying to manage her own faith and, with what Jen would have wanted. And, Jen had quite explicit instructions about certain things that needed to be in the service, but just, trying to bring in something for my aunt. But I think to their credit, and because it's a very small town in Somerset, I think the priest at my aunt's church has been incredibly supportive of her, and I don't think she feels any judgment at all, or any. So I think, if you're maybe going through suicide bereavement and a bit scared of whether or not your minister of any kind is going to react in a certain way, this is not. It's not a universal experience that people aren't going to be friendly about it.
No, absolutely not. And I think, a bit like weddings, I'm finding that funerals are more and more, people want to do what, to be honest, I want to do, which as a celebrant, which is reflect the individual. I took a funeral a few years ago now where the deceased gender was complicated, and some people in the room knew this and some people didn't. So what the family asked me to do was read the text of There's a Light from the Rocky Horror Picture Show as a funeral reading. So I'm trying to do this sort of, stop all the clocks vibe. I did cut the line over at the Frankenstein place. I mean, that was just not going to add. But it was, you end up in places with funerals where there's so many layers, and I think this is magnified after suicide. So many layers of what people know, what people experience, what people are thinking, that a good celebrant, regardless of their religious views and their worldviews, can honour the deceased in the way that they need to. And crematorium funerals are a really good way for people who want to preserve an aspect. Crematorium funerals conducted by a religious minister are a good way of sort of bridging the two worlds that often come together in funerals. There are very few families where everybody is of one worldview now. And I know I can find those to be really positive ways. And then the other thing that's in the Christian tradition that I think can be really powerful is the tradition of celebrating masses at what's called the year's mind, so the anniversary, but or of regularly interceding, praying for people who have died. And there are a number of theological interpretations of what we mean by this, but even just naming them out loud. So if I'm passing a church around the anniversary of somebody's death, I know I can just write their name on a piece of paper and their date of death, and on that date somebody will pray effectively for me. If I'm completely honest, that's an act I'm doing for myself and for my family, but in some sense for them, and to keep them present. It's a very ancient idea. I know Thucydides articulated it, but it appears in ancient Egyptian texts as well, that as long as somebody's name is alive in the world, there's some sense in which their presence is still apparent.
Very about to lower the tone. I was watching Coco the other day, and it's all about the Day of the Dead celebrations, and how basically if someone still remembers you, then the spirits can still pass through it to the land of the living to like celebrate the Day of the Dead. And it was just interesting thinking that about we don't have that same. We have statistics in modern society about the numbers of people who've died by suicide, but we don't. There may have been so much stigma around death by suicide that we don't know what happened in 1700s in Mexico or Egypt or any in India. Who knows? And so how so much of modern day interpretation of religion is based on modern day views, wherever that is. And what would have happened in a tiny village anywhere in the world if one person died by suicide is, probably as you would expect in whatever religion, some kind of communal grief and a hope that their spirit, if that's what you believe, is in the best place that it can be in the afterlife.
And we do have some evidence from church records and obviously from where people were buried. And one of the things I'll talk about England because it was slightly different in Wales and Scotland, but in England when the Reformation started to happen, one of the big fears that local people had, even if they were broadly on board with what at the time would have been called evangelicalism, Protestant is an anachronistic term, that even if they believed what the evangelicals were saying, this fear that they were condemning people to purgatory because they weren't praying the prayers and that would or paying for the masses that would pass them out. And with the controversy over where Richard III's funeral was going to be held was fascinating, because this is a pre-Reformation king. The second Tudor monarch, Henry VIII, was the architect of the Reformation as we understand it. Richard III was defeated in battle by his father, Henry VII. So the Plantagenets were Catholic. And this question of like Richard III, I think eventually it was Leicester Cathedral, which is Anglican, that hosted his funeral.
Really?
Because it's the state church. I think so. I'd have to go back and check. I remember more about the controversy than the outcome. But of course, the monarch is the head of the church. The Queen at the time considers herself a descendant of Richard III, and she is the head of the Church of England. But there's absolutely no way you could say any Plantagenet would understand what we mean by the Church of England. So we have all of these fascinating things where we've got actually really strong records of what people believed at certain snapshots, that, we know that it was a cause of real anxiety that led to some rebellions and uprisings in the 16th century. We know that one of the reasons chantries and even some of the Oxford colleges persisted is because people were quietly saying masses for the dead. And, there's fun stuff in the historical record, like, people who were hiding the parish silver because they figured that eventually they'd swing back to Catholicism anyway. But we do have quite a lot hidden in social history. But part of stigma is, what do historians look for and who's writing the history? And so I think often these questions may not be asked in a really, they're not going to be asked in a Channel 4 documentary way. I can't speak to how many excellent journal articles are being written, but they're not necessarily making it. And even when we come together in moments of commemoration, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe we do have a National Day of Prevention of Suicide, but I don't think we have a National Day or moment of silence or moment of collective grief for people who died by suicide. And I think that's really interesting as well, that we're collectively, understandably, interested in preventing death. But if you flip it and look at the value we place on war and on conflict, which is often well, we can talk about the politics of that maybe another time. We don't have a day of prevention of death in combat, although we do have some very excellent charities like Help for Heroes trying to prevent death after. But we do have a collective moment of grief for people who've died. So I think the way that religion and culture can intersect is in ritual, and what are our religious and what are our religious and secular rituals, and what do they tell us about what we value? And I think, I, off the top of my head, but I'm not great with the saints, I'm not aware of any saints whose death could be called suicide either. So who do we revere? Who are we respecting? A lot of this comes back to telling us and telling, I guess, the future social historians of our era what we thought about suicide is going to be and what's not in our records and what we're choosing not to say.
This is this whole conversation has been fascinating. You speak so eloquently, Kate. It's really amazing to just sit here and sort of listen to your sort of wise interpretation of all of this. It really is fascinating.
I don't think I know anything as in depth as you know your faith. But I couldn't speak.
I don't think I know myself as much as you know. It's amazing. From a sort of suicide bereavement support point of view, obviously, I don't want to advocate that everyone should go and find religion. Certainly not Christianity, because again, this is a very personal, unique thing. Some people, I'm absolutely sure, will find support and solace and some sort of safety in religion and spirituality. So whilst I don't want to encourage everyone to go there, because it's not going to be the right thing for everyone, for someone that has experienced sort of or held a religious belief previously, or has sort of interested in sort of rekindling their relationship with religion, what could be some practical tips for someone that's in this situation where they have lost someone to suicide to get support from a religious group or a spiritual group?
I think one thing is signposting, looking to organisations you already trust to see whether they have any partnerships with local communities that show a positive approach that would be supportive of your needs. So, for example, a lot of cruise services have historically met in church buildings. They may not have an active relationship with that church anymore, but it's likely that that's a grief-informed community. Or there might be an interfaith network connected to a bereavement service locally. Otherwise, I think it depends on how important it is to you that the local community and the local minister will understand your needs in a particular way and how willing you are to explain them and to do that emotional labour. Because I'm afraid a lot of where we find our faith family, or our family of choice in God, however you want to call it, is going to come down to who's there and who's with you. So getting to know the people, where do you feel safe? If you were, from my tradition, if you were going to light a candle somewhere, where are you drawn to? Or which church has things on the notice board, or but it may be that you're in a position that I'm also in, which is that I suppose there's loads of churches, but I don't have an MCC in my city. So you sort of do a bit of to the nearest. It's more like getting a bus than driving a car. You go where's going to get you the closest. But or it might be that there is only one Gurdwara in your city. There is only one Hindu temple. And then I think it's making the same choice you make in all of your relationships. How much are you willing to disclose? How comfortable do you need to be before you start asking these questions? But in all new relationships with people where you're choosing to share something intimate about yourself, being aware of human fallibility and having some sort of preparation in advance for what you are and aren't prepared to put up with, what you are and aren't prepared to hear, and what would be the point at which you would no longer get spiritual solace from this community. I think for a lot of people, having those lines drawn in advance is much more helpful than trying to work them out as you go through, because once you've built relationships with people and they let you down, it can be very difficult to walk away. But if you know in advance, you'd said this thing might be hurtful to me, this is the point at which I need to evaluate if it's helpful. And if you're in a space where there are people like spiritual directors or religiously informed therapists, that can also be a really good place to start. Never underestimate the value of therapy. Even if your therapist isn't spiritual, they should be able to help you to unpick your own spirituality, because it's part of who you are holistically, and may lead you to a slightly different answer to the one you were expecting. And these journeys are amazing, and they are worth taking with other people. But it's okay to spend some time kind of in the wilderness on your own, working through it as well.
It's so, I've found this so useful personally, but this conversation. But I think for a lot of people listening, and I know a lot of people that talk to Suicide&Co and have real, difficult family conflicts where religion central to it. A lot of people, really go through quite a traumatic experience of questioning whether their loved one will not be allowed into heaven or the equivalent in other religions, which is in itself is quite traumatic. Then reflecting back on themselves and the shame and grief. I just think from this whole conversation, the real key takeaway that I'm going to take away is that, our interpretation of these things is exactly that. It's our interpretation of them. And I think that in itself is going to be quite comforting to a lot of people that I know that have held a lot of shame around suicide because of their relationship with religion, when actually, I think what you said earlier around interpreting it is a unique view of it's your way of viewing what you want to view and your own experience. I think so powerful, because so many people feel this pressure to think a certain way, when actually there's so much power in just forming your own opinion. Religion is seen as this really rigid entity in life, especially from an outside point of view. I've probably fallen into the trap of sort of looking at religion as this really rigid, very strange aspect of society, but actually we're hearing from you, it's like it's not. It's really fluid and unique and progressive in some forms, in terms of your church particularly. So I think it's really interesting, and I'm sure for a lot of people listening to this that have held those views, it will be quite enlightening and surprising maybe to hear about how unique religion can be.
And I think also I've taken quite a bit from what you said about your journey to finding the right church for you. And I imagine there's probably, or your faith family, I guess. I imagine for some people, you may have been brought up in a religion, and that may not be that specific branch, that specific church, that specific temple, faith family may not be the right one for you. And so if you're going through a difficult time with, family elders, with other people around you, it, as we've said before about, on the podcast about, disputes within families, there's some diplomacy to be had, but you personally have your own journey, and you can potentially and hopefully find a journey through your faith that may be different to the one that your family have.
Yeah.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for your time, Kate. It's been absolutely brilliant talking to you, and I'm sure it's going to help a number of people that have been struggling with this point of view. I've really appreciated it. It's been great, really great.
Appreciate your openness, because part of these conversations is that we tend to talk to one another. So you'll find that religious people talking to other religious people, and communities like Suicide&Co opening up this conversation and bringing other folk in, and I hope that part of the outcome of this is that people with a different view on faith to me want to express that and to share that and to start a wider conversation, because anything any person of faith says is naturally going to be quite narrow. And, as I say, I speak for myself and neither sort of for God nor for every other Christian.
Amazing. Thank you. And all the best and good luck with all your amazing work at university as well, supporting students there. I appreciate it, Kate. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening. Conversations & Company would like to thank Acast, our wonderful guests, and all of you listeners. Thank you for your generous support. Please rate, review and subscribe, or send a link to someone who might need it. Remember, you can go to our website to check out the various support services available through Suicide&Co. We'll be back with another episode soon.